Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Dan McDermott, and I'm going to be speaking, I think, largely to the choir. If you're not familiar with one of the great books on Northwestern history, really, The Eye of the Explorer, Views of the Northern Pacific Railroad Survey, 1853-1854. I think it was published in 2010, correct, Dan? There are a few more copies for sale back there. Just fabulous work. Dan grew up in the Seattle area. He completed graduate studies in physical geography, cartography, and historical geography at the Universities of Washington and Maryland. He taught geography and cartography for 34 years at Montgomery College in Maryland. Having grown up in Washington, he's had a lifelong interest in the historical geography of the Pacific Northwest, particularly Isaac Stevens' Northern Railroad Survey and the Mulllan Military Road. He's also an avid photographer. He, Ron Grimm, and Philip Mobley authored Eye of the Explorer 4 years ago, and currently a compilation of works on the Mulllan Road is in the works, or it's getting near completion, I guess, due for publication next year by Mountain Press here in Missoula. Can you remind me of the title of that, Dan? The Mulllan Road. Well, I knew that much. It does have a subtitle, but yesterday we had the opportunity, the pleasure to, I met Dan at the airport, and we went up on one of the famous, or one of the cool stretches of the whole Mulllan Road east of Missoula, where we will be going on the tour tomorrow. And we actually were showing some pictures of that little expedition yesterday, but to me, and I think to Dan and to everybody that went, was a pretty special moment, based largely on one of the great Sohon sketches of the collection of the report. So, without further ado, Dan McDermott.
Well, thank you very much. I've been interested in Gustavus Sohon, along with Ron Grimm and Phil Mobley, since about 1990. And the earlier expert on Sohon was John Ewers at the Smithsonian Institution. And he became interested in the Sohon works as a result of Sohon's daughter Elizabeth making an offer to the Smithsonian of all of Sohon's portraitures of Native Americans that had been made in an earlier time period. Can you hear me, or do you need to be do I need to be louder? Louder. For the recording. Okay. Yeah. Do that too. All right. So anyway, Ewers was offered these materials by Sohon's daughter Elizabeth, and a similar offer was made to the Montana Historical Society, and the Montana Historical Society turned them down. They said they had no value to history. And that was an interesting commentary. There's a typescript that I have to that effect. So all of that material was kept by the Sohon family, and when Ron and I met Julian and Nancy Sohon in around 1990, we had just discovered a CD of 85 million telephone numbers in the United States. And we wondered if there were any Sohon descendants left at that point. We found 5 numbers, And so I sent out individual letters to those different people, and a few days later, I got a call back from Julian Sohon. He said, I understand you're interested in my great-great-grandfather. And I said, yes. He said, well, how would you like to come up to our home in Fairfield, Connecticut, and see the original works that we have? Ron and I were there within a week. And you're going to see one of those images that is on their family living room wall today in this presentation. But at that, fortunately, Julian and Nancy and the family were so impressed about what we had done, they made us the family biographers of Sohon, and we've been diligently working to enhance their understanding of their great-great-grandfather through the years. Today we're going to take a look. I don't want to be in people's way here. I guess I can carry this around. We're going to take a look at what Sohon did in 1858, looking at the Colonel Wright military campaign that was conducted from essentially August through October of 1858. And again, you can, if you have additional information or questions that you want to address to me later on, there's my email address at AOL. And I now live in Winchester, Virginia, whereas I used to live in Maryland. This is a picture of Gustavus Sohon that was made in 1863. He had just gotten married at this point, and at that point he was going to go west again to San Francisco to begin a ambrotype studio in San Francisco along with his new wife Julia, who he had only known for 2 weeks, which was kind of interesting. When we take a look at where the Sohon materials are located at, actually there are 3 or 4 real major locations. The Washington State Historical Society in Tacoma has most of the portraitures, which David McCandry has made a booklet about, and they had an exhibit about. Then we have another major group of material at the Smithsonian in their anthropology collection. And then another major group is at the Library of Congress. And again, as I was telling Sally a few minutes ago, most of the watercolors that were made for the Isaac Stevens Railroad Survey in 1853, 1854, they are at the Yale Art Gallery in New Haven. Now, when we originally published the book, Eye of the Explorer, we had to pay around $500 per image in order to use those images. So we didn't have the money to show all 70 watercolors. But now, interestingly, if everything is correct, those watercolors are all public domain, and you don't have to pay to use them anymore. And so in the new book on the Mulllan Road, we are going to be using more of those images. So things change with time. But again, during Sohon's lifetime, he made about 219 images, and 80 of these are portraitures of Native Americans. And these are really very important to our understanding of who these people were and what role they played in that time period. Now again, one of our problems that I've been dealing with the National Archives is that there were several key images relating to the field trip to Morrow. And one of these is this watercolor that Sohon made of the bridge across the Big Blackfoot. Ron Grimm and I went there several years ago to look at these images, and they said that they had been taken out of the collection and they had been put into a salt mine in Pittsburgh. And I said, Jay, that's really unusual because they're supposed to be part of this record group 77. What happened? Oh, those are precious images. We can't let people look at them. And I thought that's what the purpose of the archives was, is that if we're going to be dealing with accurate American history, we should be able to see the original documents. So I complained, and of course, with my loud mouth, eventually somebody listened. 5 minutes later, we had the images. And I really am incensed that any federal government employee would lie to a legitimate scholar. It really burns me up. So then when we started working on this Mulllan Road book, I asked to see if we want to make real high quality reproductions of these images along the Hellgate. Oh, I don't know about that. You can only use what we made 30 years ago is Kodacolor prints. Well, if you know anything about Kodacolor prints, the dyes fade, and they were terrible. I had taken an earlier image, and this still might be the only image we're going to be able to use in the book, because I hired a contractor. Contractor said they would not, the people at the cartographic division would not allow us to photograph the originals. So the only way we're going to be able to get real good copy again is by writing the director of the archives, the congressional representatives from Montana and the Senate, and they have to authorize it, and even then we don't know if they're going to cooperate. Very, very difficult problem of getting good material for reproduction. But again, Sohon made this image of the big Blackfoot, and again, as Keith and others know, they really did a pretty good job of constructing this bridge across the big Blackfoot. And Sohon made drawings to show how the piers were made and how the nails were laid into the boards. And that was magnificent. And again, the colors probably are slightly wrong on this one image that we have. But the other document that we wanted as part of this is this map showing the relocation of the road between the first and second crossing of the Hellgate, which today is the Clark's Fork. And again, we were not allowed access to this particular map. And but when Ron and I initially saw this back in roughly 1980, we wondered what was the significance of this. We really didn't know enough about the construction of the road at that time, and so this didn't make any sense to us. Well, what I've learned over the 40 years that I've been doing this work is that everything that Mulllan did had a purpose. And there was a reason why it was done. And when you got really interesting artistic drawings or maps, that was reflecting the fact that Mulllan really was concerned about that subject matter. And the one image we're still trying to track down now for the new Mulllan Road book is one which shows the end of Coeur d'Alene Lake, where the lake empties into the river. And at one time, as some of you may know, Mulllan was so hateful of floodwater that he was going to blow up the end of the lake in order to lower the level of the lake down so it wouldn't hurt his road on the southern end of the lake. And we always wondered, why did he make such a detailed analysis of this particular structure? But again, as Sally just brought out a few minutes ago, they were very interested in the hot spring mound. And this is the original of this. The engraving is radically different than the original. And you can see the crop lines around the image here. This is what they actually decided to use for the image. Now, this image is attributed to Gustavus. Mulllan never mentions the word Gustavus Sohon in his accounting of his trip to Fort Hall in 1854. There was no Sohon on the list. That Sohon assumedly made this image. There was a topographer in that group of 7 men. His name was Adams, and Adams was the topographer on the Stevens survey in 1853. So Adams plays a pivotal role in some of these images, but we do not know what images Adams made, which Sohon probably redid. So authorship of these images is very difficult to track down. And if any of you have gone through the report in the Stevens Report of 1860, sometimes the images will say Sohon after Stanley or Stanley after Sohon. And that's just showing that the trail is very convoluted. So Sohon definitely made this image, but the source material probably was Adams, unless Sohon at that time was going by an assumed name, and we don't know that. Yeah.
Can you hold the microphone closer to your mouth?
Oh, okay. I'll do that. Okay. So again, one of our most famous early images by Sohon was of Campment Stevens, which we're looking at here. And again, you do see the crop marks around this. Again, the actual location of Campment Stevens is still a mystery. Doug Mason down in the Bitterroot Valley has been very interested in this. And over the years that he and I have been talking, Mulllan describes this location of being at the mouth of Willow Creek. And if you go down to at the mouth of Willow Creek into the Bitterroot, there is no high point that Sohon could have made a perspective drawing of that place. So this had to be on the southeast side of Corvallis, where Willow Creek comes down with relatively high valley sides that he could have stood on and looked down on the encampment. And at that point, even today, you can see where the Willow Creek comes down and makes a T with a stream right there at that location. And I think that at that T is very close to the location of the encampment. Now, of course, one of the famous images and I was so thrilled to be able to hike with Kim and the other members of the group because I had always assumed this was up north of Alberton because of the high perspective you get here. And it was through the work of Kim's major interest in the camps in that area that clarified my understanding of where these Sohon images were really made. And I mean, some people get their kicks out of maybe reading books. Mine was standing on the spot where Sohon made this image. But when we deal with the treaty campaign of 1855, this is a map that Phil Mobley and I made showing the expedition. And as Stevens' biographer brought out, Stevens was a young man in a hurry. And one of his real concerns was making treaties with all of the tribes in the region, because his conception of these people at this time is that each native group was a sovereign nation, and at that time the native groups were being approached that they had to be treated as sovereign nations, and a treaty had to be made in order to allow later construction of a railroad or roads. And again, the treaty started off down here at Walla Walla, and that was probably the biggest operation in the whole group. They spent over a month there at that treaty site, and then they continued on to our region here at Missoula, and then they ended up east of Fort Benton at the mouth of the Judith River. But again, he really rammed down his ideas to these native groups as they were negotiating these treaties. Now, one of the most interesting drawings that Sohon ever made was at the site of the Walla Walla Treaty in June of 1855. And this is one of the images that the Sohon family had on their living room wall. And it's magnificent. It's so different from the normal Sohon because it's very stylistic and very colorful. And at this time, this scalp dance was being held because Looking Glass had come back after the treaty had been signed, and they were celebrating that he had taken a Blackfoot scalp. But at the same time, Looking Glass was very, very agitated. He said, "My people, what have you done by signing that 1855 treaty?" But again, this is a real neat portraiture of that scalp dance at Walla Walla by Sohon. And of course, a lot of the images made by Sohon on this trip were pencil drawings, like you see here. This is the encampment at the mouth of the Judith River, which was held in October of 1855. And again, it shows you the layout of the operation. It's not flipping. Oh, there we go. Okay. As a result of the turmoil that had been created by the treaty, Sohon and Stevens go back across the Bitterroots, and this is probably showing the location of Sohon Pass as it existed back in November of 1855. Oh, there we go. So the 1858 campaign begins with the Steptoe battle, which took place in May of that year. And one of the questions we had always asked about this is, was Sohon actually there? He actually observed the battle taking place. It's a very accurate image, and we do know that it's very accurate in terms of this depiction of where Steptoe's troops were located on this apron leading down into the Creek Valley. Pardon? Oh, okay. And we're looking south here, down towards Pyramid Butte or Steptoe Butte. What always struck me is here, who are these people here? Were these part of the natives in this group here, or were these Nez Perce observers? I don't know. And again, I think this is a reconstruction of what he learned by traveling there in October of 1858, along with Mulllan and Theodore Kalecki, and they put together a recreation of that particular battle. Now again, why did this conflict develop? Well, again, there are several different reasons. The federal government still hadn't ratified the treaties that were made in 1855. Government wasn't acting any more rapid than they do now. And the people with whom they made these treaty negotiations didn't understand the delay. There certainly was a difference of cultural values between the Native Americans and the settlers, particularly over land. I think the Native Americans had a view of land as territory, which with very vague boundaries, whereas the new settlers saw land as property with very definite boundaries. Certainly there was greed involved. The prospectors looking for gold was implicated in there. And of course, I think the young people with the Native Americans, they saw war as a way of becoming identified as mature individuals, that there was value to going to war to them in terms of increasing their prestige. Now again, when we take a look at the Steptoe battlefield, this is a map that Sohon and Kalecki made, showing the layout of the troops and the equipment on that apron that you just saw earlier. But that was done, this particular map was done in October of 1858. Now when we do get the campaign, this is the route followed by the campaign between August and October. And the expedition began in August and it ended in October.
the Native Americans actually were outnumbered, probably about 200 to 300, by 200 or 300 people. And also, but they were very clever because they were carrying out a black scorched earth campaign against the troops. That was one way to beat them. Take away the food for the horses, and they did that. And they almost lost. They almost won the battle at Spokane Plains because they carried out fire and were using fire as their primary weapon. There we go. Now again, the campaign started from Fort Walla Walla, and this is a multicolored image made by Sohon, and we're looking northeast towards Walla Walla, and the actual fort is seen in the foreground. Sohon liked to use wagons as a scale in his images. One of the interesting things that took place that most of the planning was taking place in a setting, and there's always one unique individual who shows up in these. Let's see if we can do this back here. There's always one unique individual that is always standing off to the side in all the treaties, and in this one we're right, he's talking to the troops. I think Sohon placed himself into that image because it's the same figure each time. Right is shown right in this part of the image. There were 12 images that Sohon made on this expedition. And most of these images up until a few years ago were all owned by the Carter Lee family in Cleveland, Ohio. And they were on display at the York Gallery in New York City. They wanted $11,000 per image. And Ron and I were so afraid that we were going to lose those images. They were just going to get scattered. And fortunately, we were able to come up with a grant of $88,000, and that's how the Library of Congress acquired the remaining 8 images of this expedition. But that's largely because the Sohon family told us where these images were. This is probably one of your only views of Fort Taylor, what it looked like at the mouth of Toucannon Creek as it enters into the, whoops, let's try that again. This is Fort Taylor, and this is the Snake River here. And again, as we take a look at the artistry, the horses here are meant to give scale to the image. But then he took another image of the crossing, and this is the right group crossing the Snake River, which you see here. And we're looking at Fort Taylor over here, and this is the Toucannon River coming down through here. Taylor and these features here were named for the military officers killed at the Sept battle. But you can see it was quite a mammoth undertaking to move 600 troops and all the equipment across the Snake River. They went up along the Palouse River Canyon, which you're seeing here. Keith Peterson certainly has shown you a very good illustration made by Sohon of the Palouse Falls. See if we can get this to move again. There we go. And this is a picture I took of Palouse Falls. Some of you may know that a kayak went over that a few years ago. And that's a 200-foot drop. I don't know why the idiot attempted to do that, but he lived. But both John McStanley and Sohon were enamored with Palouse Falls. And here, of course, is the image made by Sohon of Palouse Falls on the west side of the Palouse. Again, as you saw in the maps, they're moving north, and this is the general area where the Native Americans were using fire as a way of dealing with the troops, and it was reasonably successful. And just another early map of that particular region. But here you see the original maps that they drew of the battle at Four Lakes. You don't see this in the printed maps, but they did hand color where the positions of the Native Americans were and the troops by using colored pencil. And here is the, I think this was the map that they made of, I don't remember if that was Four Lakes, I think that's Spokane Plains. But again, these are only at the Library of Congress. One image you probably have never seen of this, which was part of the collection that Ron and I got funded, is a campsite at Four Lakes. Notice the sparse vegetation, but again, all of his work was done by was using three colored paper: blue, mid-tone, and brown. And this was the other thing that we got from the Sohon family were these tissue paper sketches made of these sites. So he was using these as studies, and then he converted them back into watercolors. This is the Battle of Spokane Plains. This is really neat, and here you see the use of the fire. And they almost lost. They almost defeated Wright at that point. But what is really interesting on this material that we got from the Sohon family, look how artistic or imaginary Sohon became when he pictured the soldiers and the Native Americans. This is all whimsy. It's all whimsy. But that, again, is just on brown tissue paper. And this shows you a little bit more detail. I tried to enhance it a little bit more. And this is showing the troops going down into the Spokane River Valley. And this is the sketch that he initially made of that, just on using pencil on that tissue paper. And then he also pictured Spokane Falls. And I believe the original for this now is at Washington State University at Pullman. And of course, they went across the Spokane Plain. This is an image of that plain with Antonone's Platte Ferry as it existed in the 1860s. But this, of course, is the most infamous picture that Sohon made, but which documents the horse slaughter camp. And the horses were captured at the mouth of at the north end of Liberty Lake. And there were over 800 horses, and they were only guarded by 2 teenagers. And the Army wanted to keep them all, but then they decided to kill every horse because they were too difficult to train. And of course, he made a picture of the Coeur d'Alene Mission at that time period. And then this is a sketch made of the mouth of the St. Joe River as it enters in the Coeur d'Alene Lake. And this is the final image. And that gives you a view of how Sohon looked at the 1858 campaign. Do we have any questions? Yes. Oh, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that anyone interested in the topography or how it got shaped that the road engineering had to deal with, Dave Ault wrote a book on the humongous flood that impacted western Montana and eastern Washington, creating the kind of configuration, topographic configuration that the road builders and designers and whatever had to deal with. It goes back to the Pleistocene, first of all.
Right,
So
definitely.
the Mulllan Road has to go back 10, 12,000 years.
Oh, okay. And, yes, sir.
Yeah, Sohon's sketches are just absolutely fantastic from a historical point of view, but also an artistic point of view. What was his professional artistic training? Did he
He was actually identified himself as university trained, probably in Tilsit in Prussia. He identifies himself as a civil engineer, but he certainly was very adept at detailed perspective drawing. But as you saw in these few sketches here, he could also do really imaginative artwork.
Yeah.
In light of what you just said there, your puzzlement over that contaminant illustration.
Oh, Stevens? Yeah.
If you look at everything that came after that, in terms of your presentation, he creates a point of view. All of those illustrations are at some elevation.
That is correct.
Looking down. So
Yeah.
he didn't climb up to some place in order to do all.
Oh, I
those.
think he did.
Those were part of his.
I think he did.
You think so? Huh?
Oh, yeah.
I doubt it.
Okay, well. No, I mean, he was a very adept engineer, and he did things precisely.
Token, we can look at Moran's paintings, and we know that he imagined a lot of this stuff.
Oh, I understand the concept. I actually think he did the climbing. A lot of the artists at that time period, like Alden, like you saw in there, he climbed to that lava bluff above the Spokane plain and did that image. And I think this happened periodically. Again, until we actually have Sohon left no diaries. There's only a few things. We really do not understand what he did. We do know Mulllan represented that Sohon would go off by himself and do his work. He was a very solitary individual. Yeah.
We've got a few more questions, but let's, in order to try to keep a little bit on schedule here, during the latter half.
Yeah, you can talk to me after the meeting.
12:30, we can either talk to you or else we can get you back up.
Yeah, sure, right.
I'm going to credited Dan a little bit extra time, and I'm taking it away from Kim this afternoon because Kim had such a long introduction that Dan didn't have as much time as he's supposed to have. Okay, anyhow, our next speaker, last speaker before lunch is Bill Youngs, and he's going to talk about the road, the Mulllan Road after John Mulllan. Bill is a professor of history at Eastern Washington University. He has long-standing interest in the Mulllan Road, including overseeing the digitizing of the Mulllan Report. He's a graduate at Harvard and Berkeley with a PhD and has published 5 books, including The Fair and the Falls Spokane Expo 1974. Bill?
I've been wondering how I was going to do this because I really need about 4 hands for the various things I want to present to you. So wish me luck, wish us luck. In my paper today, I want to take us maybe a step or two back from the previous 3 papers, which have assumed obviously the enormous importance of the Mulllan Road. And I want to ask a very bold and broad question. That is, what are we doing here? Why are we celebrating the Mulllan Road at all? It was within a year or 2 of its being built, all of the 35 or 40 bridges had been wiped out by floods or just simply by spring torrents. Trees covered the road at various times or many parts of the road, and side cuts tended to be washed out. So it was a very difficult road to travel most of the time that it was used at all. And what I want to do is take us back to basically 4 or 5 accounts of what the road was like in the early years of its use, basically up till about 1880, roughly 20 years after it was built. And basically I'm going to be letting the observers speak for themselves. And I've selected passages from 4 or 5 different accounts of the road and want to take you back to those stories through, as I say, letting the authors speak for themselves. And we're going to find that there are 2 very different views of the road. One is that it was a triumph of engineering, opening great portions of the Northwest. And the other is that it was a road-building disaster that fell into disrepair soon after it was built. And let's start with a man named Phil Ritz, who wrote for the Walla Walla Statesman in in 1865. Ritz had just been on a journey from Walla Walla across the road, and he begins one of his accounts by saying that no doubt you are hearing some dreadful tales about these mountains. Some badly frightened persons discouraged one of my teamsters entirely and tried to make me believe it would be utterly impossible to get over it all. The road is bad enough, but, and we're going to see a lot of this, the road is bad, but, or the road is good, but. So but is an operative word this morning. I have traveled over a great deal worse. Well, that's encouraging, isn't it? You may know the road is not so very bad when a man can travel from Frenchtown, of course just outside of Missoula, to the mission, being the Cataldo mission, a distance of 138 miles in 3 days on horseback. Not bad. This morning, as I crossed the summit, the snow is 1 1/2 inches deep, and 1 mile from the summit there is none. The air is pure, clear, and exhilarating, and the scenery most enchantingly lovely. From the summit in a clear day, a person has a most extended view of this mountain range. And part of the fun of reading these early accounts is that they tell us something arguably we already know, but we're proud to hear it said and again, that this country is just spectacularly beautiful, through which the road goes and which surrounds many of the regions where many of us live. Ritz had a second article in the Walla Walla Statesman in which he said, "The route by the Mulllan Road is certainly one of the most beautiful, healthful, and pleasant mountain roads on the coast to travel over at this season of the year. It is supplied with abundance of the finest grass, timber shade, and purest waters. The finest mountain trout weighing 1 to 6 pounds and salmon trout from 8 to 20 pounds can be caught in the streams, where the plains and timber abound with grouse, chickens, pheasants, deer, moose, elk, ibex, antelope, sheep, goats, bears, panthers, and cougars, and the most sublime mountain scenery, altogether presenting one of the most delightful routes for travel on the coast. The valleys of the Bitterroot and Hellgate are much larger than I expected to find up there in the Rocky Mountains, and are rapidly setting up with good, industrious, enterprising families. This season they have raised in those valleys about 30,000 bushels of wheat and 15,000 bushels of oats and barley, besides great quantities of vegetables. And of course, at the time, shortly after the road was built, this region began to fill up with some agriculture and, of course, the various mining camps. And in the meantime, Walla Walla was expanding greatly its agricultural production. And one of the things that the road was able to service is the traffic back and forth of people and goods involved in that agriculture and mineral progress. By the way, Ritz also mentions one of the other routes that people were beginning to take, and that would be to go north and up to the north end of Lake Pend Oreille, and then take a steamboat down across the Pend Oreille River. It was expensive, but as he's pointed out, it was a lot easier than horseback on some of these routes. That said, though, he points out that it was longer to go that way, and that the Mulllan Road was really the best of a bad set of alternatives. Now, at about that time, a year later, the legislators of Washington made an appeal to Washington, D.C. for funds to reopen the road or to improve the road. And remember, this is just 3 or 4 years after the road had been completed. They write, "Your memorials, the Legislative Assembly of the Territory of Washington, respectfully represent to your honorable bodies that the wagon road from Wallula, Old Fort Walla Walla, located on the Great Bend of the Columbia River, to Fort Benton on the Missouri River, and generally known as the Mulllan Wagon Road, is for a great portion of the distance through the Coeur d'Alene and Bitterroot Mountains in an almost impassable condition for wagons on account of fallen timber and the destruction of bridges." So almost impassable, but it must be borne in mind that from the time Honorable Isaac Stevens entered upon the preliminary survey up to the period of the completion of this great national highway, And you will see Keith Peterson uses that phrase in his own book about Mulllan, and it's one that several documents phrase. This great national highway, nearly the whole region of the country through which it passed, comparatively speaking, an uninhabited region previously, infested by bands of hostile Indians. Now the scene is changed. What in 1849 composed only the territory of Oregon now comprises the state of Oregon and the territories of Washington, Idaho, and Montana. What was then a wilderness now maintains a large and rapidly increasing population, producing millions of bushels of grain and millions of dollars per annum of gold and silver. The opening of the road is one of the greatest, most vital importance to the people of Washington, Idaho, and that portion of Montana lying west of the Rocky Mountains. And in the opinion of your memorialist, in a military point of view, its value cannot be overestimated. So again, there's a kind of a sense of ambivalence about it. This is wonderful. Undoubtedly, the country is wonderful. Undoubtedly, the people are beginning to prosper in minerals and agriculture. And undoubtedly, there is a road. But what you say about the road always has that but. You can get across it, but it's pretty rough, or it's impassable, but you can still get across it. Now, we're going to see this in one of my favorite early accounts. We're jumping ahead now to 1875, and a man named Eli Glover is traveling across the road. And he writes, the road climbed fearful grades, only to go down again on the other side. Lieutenant Mulllan seems to have had a mania for getting up as high as possible and then to get down the steepest place he could find. We suppose his object was to make the road as direct as possible, but we think distance could have been saved by following the sides of the hills around by a uniform grade in place of going up and down so much. The Indians have better trails in some places that we followed instead of the road. And there's not really a but in Glover's account. I'm afraid it's sort of unremittingly harsh, but that said, it does have its humorous moments. He talks about sitting around a fire one night and just comparing, on the route, comparing different stories about the experiences on the road. And one person gives the account of a German teamster said he undertook to drive up one of Mullan's steep grades, and that the horses missed their footing and fell back plumb into the wagon. I love that image of the horses actually going upside down and upside down in the wagon with their legs presumably straight up. Now, Glover does have some doubts about this. He says, we didn't believe it, but still, having seen the road, it looks possible. And then finally, in terms of this sampling of reports, we have Lieutenant General Phil Sheridan's report in 1877 of a military expedition across the route. And his report, too, has its moments and has this same kind of ambivalence. The road, he says, still remains plain, but all bridges have been swept away by winter avalanches and is obstructed by fallen trees. In some instances, we could work our way around trees, but the forest became more and more dense so that logs had to be cut and moved aside or be bridged. Now, how do you bridge a log? That is, a tree too large to be cut was passed by piling other logs and chunks alongside and going over with all our wagons. So they built sort of stairways up these big logs and then down the other side. Of course, this was at first awkward to our mules, who gradually became more used to it, and may at last be said to have performed the feat of climbing a tree. And then the report goes on to say, although we all know the equivalent of but, a portion of the route presented serious difficulties, yet it was proven to be practicable for lightly loaded vehicles, even in its present condition, by the fact that upon reaching Walla Walla, the 2 ambulances and the light wagon with the 12 mules that had drawn them, were turned into the quartermaster's department in good condition. The fine condition of the animals was in no small degree due to the foresight of Captain Mulllan, who had caused grass seed to be sown along that portion of the route between the ferry and the Coeur d'Alene Lake. And I was delighted to find that in preparing this talk, because we do know that he did this kind of planting, but to see somebody, about 15 years later saying the grass was still there shows one of the many things that Mulllan did right. And so that the pasturage would not have been there otherwise. And then finally, from the Sheridan report, this road, they say, should be reopened to travel. And again, it's this sort of ambiguous language. It is open, people are getting over it, but they constantly say it should be reopened, which of course means it should be improved. I have crossed it with wagons, which is proof that it is possible. And possible is in italics. It is possible. And I am convinced that next summer, by the labor of 2 detachments of infantry, one working west from Missoula and the other east from Coeur d'Alene, the road could be made good enough for present wants, one of which is to me conclusive. Such a road will enable us to reinforce Montana from this quarter, that is from Walla Walla, or to reinforce this department from Montana should a necessity arise. Had the Mulllan Road been open, Howard could have reached Missoula before the Nez Perce and would not have been forced to follow them across mountains from Lapwai to the Mussel Shell. Interesting kind of conjecture. And this remembers 1877, and when was the Nez Perce War? That very same year, would have been a few months before that would have taken place. Well, what I hope to have shown by these sample comments, and unfortunately there aren't as many as one would wish. One would wish that there were hundreds of letters and journals about going over the Mulllan Road in the first 20 or 30 years. They are comparatively rare. They're more than the 4 that I've cited here. But they're enough and there's enough of a pattern that I think we can see that this is a road that you look at it one way and it's a wonderful success, another way it just didn't do anything. I want to come down strongly, though, on the side of its having done something. First, just very quickly, I want to allude to the fact that there's a certain amount of scholarly literature out there to the effect of the importance of the Mulllan Road. I'm looking here at portions of an article by Oscar Osborne Winther, written many years ago, that talked about the early commercial importance of the Mulllan Road in terms of the Walla Walla connection with this region. Alex McGregor said essentially the same thing on an article called The Economic Impact of the Mulllan Road. I have been reading quickly. We scholars feel that there's nothing worse than giving a talk and finding that you haven't read the most recent scholarship. So I carefully bought this morning, and I've been sneaking a peek at it. I felt a little guilty about it as 3 others of you have been talking, because one of my bête noire as a historian is a student that's looking at their cell phone. And so I was sneaking a peek at this book. But, and Keith Peterson can tell us whether I've got this right or not, but my impression is that he would, his final chapter uses that phrase, about the great international highway, and does show some of this same ambivalence about it. But what I would like to accentuate here is that you have to look also at what came before. And let's take a moment and go back to the Mulllan Report itself, and this is by Sohon. And he was working his way east from the mission, the Cataldo mission, and was hoping for help from local Indians to figure out the route. And he had a man named Augustin who was working for him. And in those days, the Indians, by and large, did their best to suggest that whatever route you were thinking about, there was a better route somewhere else, like 50 miles north. And this goes back, as a colonial American historian, I can tell you it goes right back to the early colonies, when one of the things that the settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts and New York were hoping for was that they could go up a particular river and then reach the Pacific Ocean, that the Northwest Passage would be right there. And Indians often told these folks, well, this river won't get you there, but go 50 miles north and you can do that. Well, Augustine had started out by helping and then was dissuaded. And here's the account from Sohon. On June 24, we rested in camp, for our animals were now weary and fatigued, and we thought it best to halt and prepare for our task of ascending the ridge. All had gone well up to this point, but here our evil genius seemed to have attended us in the person of Damas, the brother of my guide Augustine, whom we met hunting in the mountains. After a series of endeavors and intrigues on the part of Damas, he succeeded in changing the mood of his brother Augustine, who then determined not to accompany me further. He came to me and said as follows, "Let us have a better understanding. I told you at Walla Walla that there was no road through this section of the Flathead country. The mountains are too difficult. Those high ridges yonder, pointing to some high spurs of the Bitterroot range, are small compared to those over which we shall be compelled to pass. There are many of them. The road would pass over high and steep mountains and down into steep ravines and canyons. If all Americans would work here 1,000 years, they could never make a road. If all Americans could work here 1,000 years, they could never make a road." Well, here we are, a few years later, instead of 1,000 years later, and there was, of course, in fact, a road. And I would like to argue that most importantly, the Mulllan Road helped change the mental map of this region. If you think about it, right at the beginning of the 19th century, Lewis and Clark came through this area, a bit south, crossed the Bitterroot Mountains, stumbled into a Nez Perce village, and just barely survived. That was as close to the expedition simply disappearing as at any point in crossing the continent. And we're not talking 10 years later that Mulllan comes out or 20 years later. It's almost a half a century later before they even built this road. And the road was, of course, in many ways very insufficient. Did side cuts wash away? Yes. Did trees fall across the road? Yes. Did bridges give way to spring torrents? Yes, again and again. And today, by way of comparison, there's several 100,000 miles of Forest Service roads that are like super highways in comparison to the Mulllan Road. And yet, it was there. It was a road. Pioneers used it. General Sheridan used it. And even when they used that big word but, or although, it was always in the context of, this is important. This is something worth doing. We've shown that it is possible. There are people going across it, and we can improve it. We can continue improving it. Well, did they improve it? Think about it. It gave way ultimately to great modern highways, the early ones like the Yellowstone route, Route 10, and of course, those of us coming from the Spokane area, as my brother and I did yesterday, at various points we're right on the Mulllan Road on Interstate 90. So it did make its way. And so what I'd like to think of is that we're here today celebrating a very humble, but at the same time a very astonishing engineering feat, the Mulllan Road.
In your view, what would be the estimated length of time of use of the original Mulllan Road before significant changes?
Well, one interesting thing about the Mulllan Road, I guess I better keep this here. One interesting thing about the Mulllan Road is it's really many different roads, isn't it? I mean, it's used for different purposes at different times. There are probably a lot fewer people that went from Walla Walla to Fort Benton or the other direction the whole distance than, say, went from Walla Walla to the Missoula area, or that went from Fort Benton down to the Goldfields. And I think even more than that, there were local portions of the road that existed for different amounts of time. But I would guess that the Mulllan Road, and others might be able to comment better than me on this, was very much a going concern for at least into the 1880s and possibly the 1890s. It's constantly your reference point at this point. You know, it's always, it could be better, but it is the Mulllan Road that could be better. I would, so I'd say about the 1880s or 1890s, maybe really until the Yellowstone Road is built. Does anybody want to weigh in on that? Bill?
The Yellowstone Road was never built. It was a conglomeration of existing traveled ways that they designated the Yellowstone Trail.
Though those existing ways that were ultimately paved, they were paved fairly, I wonder when the first pavement was.
First paving was probably, what, in Montana, where Alice, maybe the 1913 era when they started having the DOTs?
In this area and in Washington, you're talking about 1915.
1915 was the first actual pavements.
Well, it depends on how you want to define paved.
We're talking gravel.
What is amazing from an engineering point of view is what they did with such small amount of resources, and just how much easier it is now with modern technology and earth-moving equipment and so on. It just boggles my mind that there are literally several 100,000 miles of these gravel Forest Service roads that the travelers on the Mulllan Road would have just been delighted to see. Yeah.
I just wanted to add on as we go over I-90 yesterday that there were parts of it that could be improved. and they infer that they were improving parts of it.
That's true. They're constantly rebuilding it.
There's 2 seasons.
Yeah.
Road work.
Yeah. This is true. Yes.
Yeah, I thought this, where the trail was so steep, or the road was so steep, that the mules could have fallen back into the wagon. I can show you some places that it did kind of steep, going up over Sohon Pass. The only thing is, I don't know how they would put brakes on the wagon, but we would have allowed the horses to do that.
That's true. They started to fall back, the wagon.
The road up over Sohon Pass on the Montana side, was straight up. Because it's switch back there, it's just the pass to the south and look up that there, how it goes.
It's almost, I'm sure there must have been a lot of tall tales around the campfires at that time. Now, something like when you hear in the Sheridan report that they had to build kind of bridges over the logs, that's probably true. The horse falling back, you know, maybe we should have a vote on it later on as to whether that could happen.
My name is Jim Sear. I was raised right across from the big side cut on the Mulllan Road across the river. And my granddad related the story that when they would travel this side cut in wagons, if they had a rider or somebody go ahead and warn if anybody else was coming the other way, they would do that. But occasionally they didn't have that luxury, so there would be 2 wagons meeting in the area of the side cut. And this was a pretty long area, but have no way to pass. They would unload one wagon, take it apart, and put it up on the hill, let the wagon pass, and then bring it back down and put it back together.
My gosh. That's a wonderful anecdote. And that said, by the way, many of you probably know where the big side cut is, but is it around milepost 62? Is that about right? Yeah, I think it's about, you can see a big range of escarpment there, and that's where it was.
Now, what they call today the Triple Bridge is named by the Raptors, but what the old time was called the Thinning Bridge, which was because of the purple top rock there, which was called the Thinning Bridge.
Thank you. Yes.
Was Mulllan originally given a charge simply to lay out a military trail or road versus a commercial homestead travel road? It makes a big difference in the steepness and everything else. A regiment of soldiers can go up and over all sorts of rough terrain,
Yeah.
pulling a cannon or whatever.
It was intended as a wagon road, and a lot of the time, probably at least half the travel on it, maybe much more, was by pack train, by mule, by foot. You may have noticed in Dan McDermott's picture, there's one of something, one of Sohn's drawings shows mules going up a trail that looks like the Grand Canyon, and how there would, whether there ever could have been a wagon track at that point, I don't know. But as to whether it was for military or civilian purposes, there's only one real military expedition, and even that was an experiment that went over it in, was it 62 or 61?
I'm talking about
Was
the
it
charge
60?
that he was given up front at step one, day one. Military versus the discovery later that it could be used commercially in homesteaders. And then the two concepts would conflict.
But it was a military wagon road. That means
The good way to look at this is, what does MR stand for? Originally, it was military road, and it's interesting seeing these references to the Mulllan Road. They'll put it in quotation marks in 62, 63. It's just beginning to be called the Mulllan Road, and how convenient that on the marks on trees and so on said MR. So you could, if Mullin had been named Smith, you know, maybe we wouldn't, maybe it'd still be known as the military road.
Do you have any information that would talk about how much of the traffic, the freight that was moved on the road was moved in the different years by wagon as opposed to pack train, and how that changed over time?
You know, I only know it more anecdotally and just seeing here and there reports that are kind of saying, in fact, one of the reports that I didn't get to read talks about people making fun of of certain type of people trying to take a wagon over it, because they're all, I mean, the convention is that you don't try to take a wagon across it. So I would guess that it's a small proportion. Now that said, some of these longer accounts by McDermott and others, and particularly, I don't know, is Keith here? Keith Peterson? Yes. Well, can you answer that question about the proportion?
Well, both those questions are really interesting questions. I want to get to this one real fast. There was a great controversy about the reach of the federal government. I mean, does it sound familiar? About whether the federal government could actually go out into an area and build a commercial road. The local residents, of course, wanted to have a commercial road, but what the government was able to build was a military road. But everyone knew that as soon as the military road was done, it was going to be used for commercial purposes. So Mullan's task was to create a road 25 feet wide, suitable for wagons. As to the question about the pack trains, that's really interesting. I don't think that there's a lot of, we have anecdotal information, but like Bill says, the road is really, I look at it as three distinct roads. There's the road in eastern Washington, was incredibly heavily traveled between Walla Walla and Spokane and places like that. There's the road in Montana, incredibly heavily traveled with lots of wagon. I mean, that's why you have the bullwhacker statue down in Helena. The bullwhackers taking huge wagons along the Mulllan Road. But very seldom was that done to supply mines and so on over the Bitterroots, which is the third part, the part that everyone calls a failure. I'd hazard a guess that no one who lived out here in the mid-19th century would have called the eastern or western portions of the Mulllan Road a failure. It was that part over the Bitterroots, and that was almost exclusively packed, including some camels. Settlers would take wagons there, but not so much folks who were moving freight back and forth. But as to the numbers, the only time I've really seen real numbers is Alex McGregor's book talks about, his article, his thesis talks about, he actually got a hold of the records of Lyons Ferry, not too far out of Walla Walla, and actually tracks the amount of traffic on the Mulllan Road over the course of a number of years. But that sort of information isn't available, as near as I know, for other parts.
And that said, that it'd be easy enough to take a wagon, say, to Spokane or that area, but going over the Bitterroots was another question. Quickly on that military road issue, the early government basically stayed out of road building entirely, and it was very controversial even to build a simple toll road. It became a little bit more common later on. But as late as the 1960s, there was an effort to improve the highway system in the United States, and a fellow named Eisenhower decided that it would be good to establish what went down as military roads. That's how they were described. And what are they today? The interstate highway system. So it was you could be saying that this is justified, we need it as a military road, but with everybody understanding that it would also be for other uses. And luckily in those days, a road that would sustain a howitzer carriage or whatever would also sustain a wagon with immigrants. Today, getting a tank is going to be different than an automobile. I'm getting this sign.